Welcome to the All Sorts podcast, your one-stop shop for all sorts of fascinating deep dives.
That's right.
And today, we're going deep into the world of Kofi Annan,
Oh, wow.
a man who really walked this incredible line between war and peace for decades as a UN leader.
Yeah. Yeah. A fascinating figure. You know, he left such a powerful legacy, and not just in his actions, but in his words, too.
That's exactly why we're focusing on his book, Interventions, A Life in War and Peace.
Mm-hmm.
We'll also pull in some insights from his Wikipedia entry and a biography called Kofi Annan, a man of peace in a world of war, just to add some extra, color to the whole picture.
It's really striking how his story begins with this almost contagious optimism, shaped by his upbringing in what was then the Gold Coast.
It was the 1930s, a time of just incredible hope for these newly independent African nations. You know, when you think about it, that backdrop must have just profoundly influenced his whole worldview.
It did. And there's this great little detail in the biography about his father. He was a tribal chief, and he instilled in Kofi this really strict sense of punctuality.
Really?
Yeah. It's almost like this tiny window into those values that shaped him, values he carried his whole life.
That's fascinating. It's like this little personal detail foreshadowing the meticulous diplomat he'd later become.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's trace his path through the UN. I mean, he starts as an administrative officer, but quickly rises through the ranks. What were some of those early roles? And can you imagine the challenges he faced as an African leader? I mean, in a system that, let's face it, was pretty Western-centric.
Well, he held some key roles at the UN Economic Commission for Africa and was very involved in peacekeeping operations. Even in those early years. This was the 60s and 70s.
Oh, wow.
And the UN was still, figuring out its place in a post-colonial world. I mean, I can only imagine the hurdles he must have faced.
Yeah, and here's where things get even more complex. The relationship between the UN and the U.S., particularly during these major crises, adds a whole other layer to his story.
Absolutely. Take the first Persian Gulf War.
Right.
And the Somali intervention. I mean, these events really brought the idea of the indispensable nation to the forefront, highlighting that, immense power the U.S. wielded within the UN. Annan had to constantly navigate that dynamic, especially when, U.S. interests and UN peacekeeping goals didn't quite align.
And in his book, Interventions, he really grapples with those limits of peacekeeping in the face of, American military might. I mean, it's a recurring theme, wouldn't you say?
It is. He saw firsthand how peacekeeping missions could get tangled in what he calls mission creep. Their scope expanding beyond that initial mandate, often because of political pressures. And then there's this constant tension between respecting a nation's sovereignty and the need to intervene for humanitarian reasons.
He's always asking, how do we balance these competing forces?
Right.
And it all comes to a head with the Rwandan genocide in 1994.
Yeah. That was a pivotal moment. And, of course, a tragic one.
Yeah.
Annan, then Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, he actually received intel about the planned violence beforehand.
Wow.
But the decision-making process, for all sorts of reasons, it resulted in UN troops being withdrawn, and it's a decision that's haunted the organization ever since.
In his book, does he reflect on this? Does he talk about the criticism he faced?
He does. It's clear that this really weighed heavily on him. He acknowledges the UN's failure, but he also emphasizes the complexities of that situation, the fog of war, the political pressures, the limits of information. It's a really nuanced reflection on a deeply troubling chapter in his career.
Yeah, I'm seeing a pattern here, this constant kind of wrestling with those ideals of peacekeeping versus the often harsh realities on the ground.
And that pattern continues in the Bosnian War, where we encounter this fascinating concept of what's called the double key.
Okay, what does that even mean? A double key to what?
So basically, both the UN and NATO had control over the use of force in Bosnia.
Oh, wow.
I mean, imagine trying to steer a ship with two captains at the helm.
Oh, man.
It created this constant challenge in coordinating military action, especially with a Security Council that was anything but unified.
It sounds like a recipe for gridlock, maybe even disaster.
It certainly was a high-wire act. And it's interesting to compare Annan's approach to that of his predecessor, Boutros Ghali, who was known for being, more assertive, even confrontational.
Oh, yeah.
And even back then leaned towards diplomacy, building consensus.
Yeah. It seems like those leadership styles would clash pretty quickly.
They did. Boutros-Ghali's time was marked by tensions with the U.S., particularly after the Somalia intervention. The Americans were looking for a different kind of leader, someone they felt they could work with more effectively.
And that's where Annan steps in. He wasn't even actively campaigning for the role of Secretary General, was he?
No, he wasn't. But he emerged as this consensus candidate, someone seen as capable of bridging divides and fostering dialogue. His leadership style, emphasizing openness and transparency, was, well, a stark contrast to Boutros-Ghali's.
It almost sounds like the UN was craving a breath of fresh air.
You could say that. And he brought this distinct personal touch to the role.
Right.
He was known for connecting with people on a human level, emphasizing the importance of human rights, and believing deeply in the UN's potential as a force for good.
And it's against this backdrop that he faces the Iraq crisis of 1998, a major early test as Secretary General. His decision to travel to Baghdad and negotiate directly with Saddam Hussein is just a prime example of what he called quiet diplomacy in action.
It was a bold move. A gamble that could have backfired spectacularly. He was trying to avert a military confrontation over UN weapons inspections. The whole world was watching.
How did people react to this? It must have been a controversial decision.
Oh, absolutely. Some praised his courage while others questioned his judgment. It was this delicate balancing act, maintaining dialogue with Iraq while navigating those pressures from the U.S. But in the short term, his mission succeeded. And it really shaped the early part of his tenure.
But I get the sense that shadow of Rwanda never really left him, even as Secretary General. Did that experience continue to inform his decisions?
It did. He was constantly reminded of it, criticized for the UN's failure to act. But in his responses, there's this sense of deep reflection, acknowledging the mistakes, but also trying to explain those complexities, the impossible choices.
So did Rwanda change his thinking on intervention? Did it force him to refine those principles?
That's where his 1999 Ditchley lecture comes in. It's in this speech that he really lays out his evolving views on intervention.
Okay.
And those views would directly shape his actions in Kosovo and East Timor.
It feels like we're about to enter a whole new chapter in his story. But before we do, I just want to pause and remind our listeners about something incredibly important. The All Sorts podcast is all about exploring new ideas, diving deep into fascinating topics, just like this one. And we wouldn't be here without you.
That's right.
Our amazing listeners. So before we continue this incredible journey through the life of Kofi Annan, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads for more thought-provoking content. It's your support that helps us keep those all sorts conversations going. Now let's get back to Kofi Annan and his evolving approach to intervention, starting with the crisis in Kosovo.
Kosovo really put those ideas to the test. It was 1998, and Serbian forces were cracking down on ethnic Albanians. The world was on edge, really another humanitarian disaster in the making.
And Annan, he had laid out his principles in the Ditchley lecture,
right,
but now he had to actually put them into practice,
which
I imagine was no easy feat.
No, not at all. He pushed for a diplomatic solution, but the talks with Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic, they went nowhere. And meanwhile, those reports of atrocities just kept pouring in. It was real catch-22.
Yeah, intervention without Security Council approval, that would be a huge problem.
Sure.
But inaction, well, that could mean another Rwanda. So what did he do?
Well, true to his, belief in multilateralism, he tried to get the Security Council on board for some form of intervention. But it was almost guaranteed that Russia would veto any resolution authorizing the use of force. They were a staunch ally of Serbia.
And the U.S., growing impatient with that whole Security Council deadlock, starts hinting at going it alone, like a NATO-led intervention without a UN mandate. Talk about a diplomatic tightrope walk.
It really was. Annan was wary of unilateral action, but he also recognized just how urgent the situation was. His book really reveals that inner conflict he must have felt, trying to balance his principles with, well, the very real possibility of mass violence.
So what happened? Did he endorse NATO's actions?
Well, NATO launched airstrikes against Serbian targets in March 1999, and it was hugely controversial. Russia condemned it as illegal. Annan's public statements were really carefully crafted. He expressed regret that diplomacy had failed.
Yeah.
But he also acknowledged just how desperate the situation was in Kosovo.
So it sounds like he was trying to thread a very fine needle.
Yeah. He was critical of the lack of a UN mandate, but he also recognized the need to stop the bloodshed. This is Classic Annan. That nuanced diplomacy,
Right.
working within a flawed system, but always striving for the best possible outcome.
And then there's East Timor, another case where Annan's evolving approach to intervention really played out on the world stage.
Right. East Timor, a former Portuguese colony occupied by Indonesia since 1975. And in 1999, after years of brutal repression, Indonesia agreed to a UN-sponsored referendum on independence. There was a glimmer of hope.
But things didn't exactly go smoothly, did they?
No.
Yeah.
When the East Timorese voted overwhelmingly for independence, well, the pro-Indonesian militias, backed by elements of the Indonesian military, they went on a rampage, another humanitarian crisis unfolding.
And the UN was once again faced with that agonizing choice.
Right.
Intervene or risk a massacre.
Yeah.
So how did Annan respond this time?
Initially, he was hesitant to push for intervention without Indonesia's consent. He believed in working within the UN Charter, but he also just couldn't ignore the unfolding tragedy. It was a familiar dilemma.
So what tipped the scales?
International pressure, including Annan's, strong advocacy, led to the deployment of an Australian-led peacekeeping force to East Timor. In this case, that combination of diplomacy and, a willingness to use force when absolutely necessary, it seemed to work.
So a success story.
To a degree, yes. The violence was eventually contained and East Timor gained its independence, but that path to peace was long and painful, and those scars of the conflict, they remain.
It all circles back to that central theme of Annan's time at the UN, that constant struggle to reconcile the ideals of the organization with the realities of a world that's often driven by, power and self-interest.
Absolutely. Throughout his career, he tried to navigate that complex landscape, upholding the principles of multilateralism, peaceful conflict resolution, but also recognizing that sometimes decisive action was needed to prevent mass suffering.
His legacy, like the man himself,
Yeah.
is complex and, full of contradictions.
Yeah.
But interventions. A Life in War and Peace offers us a window into his thinking, his struggles, his triumphs, his failures.
It's a reminder that peace isn't a destination, but a journey. Often a very difficult one. And it requires not only diplomacy, but also the courage to make those tough choices when the stakes are so high.
Speaking of tough choices, something that really struck me about Annan was that emphasis on personal connection.
Yeah.
Even amidst those global crises, it's like he never lost sight of that human element, the individuals caught in the crossfire.
You're right. And in interventions, he doesn't shy away from sharing those personal reflections. He talks about the emotional toll of witnessing such suffering, the burden of responsibility, and that constant questioning of whether he could have done more.
And yet, he never seems to give up on dialogue. Even with figures like Saddam Hussein, who many saw as just a brutal dictator, he believed that communication, however difficult, was, essential.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways from his life and his book, The Power of Dialogue. Even when it seems impossible, even when faced with those seemingly insurmountable obstacles, never give up on that possibility of finding common ground.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And one that, resonates deeply in today's world.
Yeah.
But there's more to unpack in Annan's story.
Yeah.
And specifically, the evolution of his thinking on intervention. We'll delve into that right after a quick word from our sponsor.
And we're back, diving right back into Kofi Annan's Interventions, A Life in War and Peace. We've seen how he grappled with peacekeeping, the weight of responsibility, those really agonizing choices
Tough stuff.
faced by the UN. But throughout it all, there's this thread of evolution.
Right.
This constant refining of his approach to intervention.
Almost like he's on a personal quest to, reconcile those UN ideals with the just messy realities of the world.
Totally. And his Ditchley lecture, that was a turning point.
Right.
It's like he's laying out this new framework for when and how to intervene.
Yeah.
He argues that state sovereignty, while crucial, it shouldn't be an absolute shield,
Right.
for regimes that are committing atrocities against their own people. He also emphasizes that multilateralism thing again, stressing that interventions should, ideally, have broad international support and a clear legal basis.
But wasn't he also aware of the dangers of intervention? I mean, the potential for things to go wrong, the unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely. He stresses that military intervention should be a last resort. And even then, it needs clear objectives, a well-defined exit strategy,
Right.
and a commitment to rebuilding and reconciliation afterward. It's a very cautious approach, almost hesitant, born out of those experiences in Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere.
So how does this new framework actually play out? Did he apply these principles to his decisions as Secretary General?
We see glimpses of it in how he handled the Kosovo crisis, where he's trying to balance that need for action with that desire for a UN mandate.
Okay.
And it's even more evident in his response to East Timor, where he pushes for intervention, but only after exhausting all other diplomatic options.
So is this his ultimate legacy, a revised, more nuanced approach to intervention?
It's definitely a part of it, but I think his greatest contribution might be, well, something less tangible, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's his unwavering belief in the power of dialogue,
Right.
his willingness to engage with even the most difficult actors, and that insistence that we have to keep striving for peace, even when the odds seem completely stacked against us.
There's something really inspiring about that. It's a message that goes beyond the specifics of his career, the debates about intervention, all the complexities of the UN.
It does.
It's a call to action for all of us.
It is. He reminds us that peace isn't just the absence of war.
Right.
It's this constant process, a daily commitment to understanding, to empathy, to finding that common ground.
And it's a journey we all have a part in, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Annan's life and his book, Interventions, it serves as this powerful reminder that each of us, in our own way, can contribute to building a more peaceful world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you, our incredible listeners, for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a journey through history, through diplomacy, through the heart and mind of a remarkable man.
And remember, the All Sorts podcast is your guide to exploring the world of ideas, uncovering those hidden gems of knowledge, and sparking those aha moments.
So if you enjoyed this episode, please hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads. We've got a whole universe of fascinating topics waiting to be explored, and we can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, keep those all sorts conversations going.